here is something nobody tells you when you buy a house. The moment you close the door for the last time, the house begins to die. Not immediately, not dramatically. But from that day forward, everything inside it is working against itself. The roof absorbs water. The foundation shifts. Whatever life was inside starts to leave through the walls. Canada has approximately 1.3 million vacant properties. Most of them are ordinary vacancy. Empty between tenants, between owners, between decisions. But some of them are abandoned in a way that is different from simply being empty. They have been relinquished, left mid-sentence with furniture still in the rooms and calendars still on the walls and whatever happened inside them still pressing against the wallpaper from the other side. The 15 houses in this video are those houses. Some of them are famous, some of them are almost completely unknown. All of them are still standing, or were until very recently, which is arguably more unsettling than if they had simply been torn down. Because a demolished house is a closed question. An abandoned one is not. These are 15 abandoned houses in Canada that stayed. Number 15 is the Malahat Chalet, on the Malahat Summit in British Columbia, above the Saanich Inlet on the way to Victoria. For 4 decades, it served as one of the defining stop-off points on a route that tens of thousands of people drove every year. The view from its windows encompassed the full length of Finlayson Arm, a stretch of fjord-like inlet that most people who saw it once never entirely forgot. It burned in 1958 and was rebuilt. It burned again in a second fire that ended the rebuild's career decisively. What remained after the second fire was the foundation, sections of wall, and the chimney standing alone at the summit like the one thing that refused to accept what had happened. The ruins sat at elevation for years, visible from the road, collecting weather. Hikers photographed it from the trail below and posted the images without being entirely sure what they were looking at. A chimney, some concrete, a view that explains why someone thought this was the right place to stop. The Malahat Summit has been widened and rerouted and improved so many times since then that the site of the original structure has become approximate, more a region than a location. That is the specific way that the highway erases things, not by demolishing them. By moving around them until the address no longer makes sense. Number 14 is the Road House on Barclay Street in Vancouver's West End, which is not technically abandoned, which is exactly what makes it worth examining in this context. Built in 1893 by bookbinder Gus Rohde to a design by Francis Rattenbury, who would go on to design the British Columbia Legislature and the Empress Hotel before being murdered by his wife's lover in England in 1935. The Rohde House was one of the last Victorian residences in a neighborhood that was entirely redeveloped into apartment buildings during the 20th century. Every other house on the block is gone. The Rohde House is a museum now, fully restored, open for tours, which means it survived, but the context that made it meaningful did not. A Victorian house standing alone among towers, maintained to museum standard, is performing a kind of haunting of its own, dressed in its original paint, recreating a neighborhood that no longer exists around it. It is the only building on Barclay Street that remembers what Barclay Street was. And there is something about a house that has outlived its entire era that sits closer to abandonment than preservation, regardless of what the sign on the door says. Number 13 is the Skagway-era roadhouse near Whitehorse, Yukon. Roadhouses were the infrastructure of the Klondike Gold Rush. Spaced at intervals that corresponded to a day's travel by horse or foot, they offered food and shelter, and sometimes a floor to sleep on, to the people moving through the territory, in volumes that the territory had never seen and would never see again. Most of them lasted precisely as long as the rush lasted. When the rush ended, the traffic stopped. When the traffic stopped, the income stopped. When the income stopped, the owners left, and the buildings began the process that all wooden structures in the subarctic eventually undertake, which is a slow collapse into the permafrost beneath them. The roadhouse structures that survive are architectural evidence of a specific moment in Canadian history. The moment when the Yukon was, briefly, a place that thousands of people passed through on the way to somewhere they believed would change their lives, and which mostly did not. A collapsed roadhouse is a failed dream, made literal. The walls that could not hold, the floor that gave way, the roof that opened to the sky. They are everywhere in the Yukon backcountry, and almost nobody who was not specifically looking for them would know to stop. Number 12 is Choose House in Barkerville, British Columbia. Barkerville is the well-preserved gold rush town that draws heritage tourists every summer, and Choose House is at the edge of the Heritage District, in the zone where preservation gives way to decay. The Chinese miners and merchants and workers who built and sustained Barkerville during and after the rush were largely written out of the official heritage narrative for most of the town's institutional history. Choose House survived that erasure by being too structurally marginal to demolish and not prominent enough to restore. It stands at an angle now. The foundation has shifted enough that the walls have compensated. The doorway is a parallelogram. Inside, according to those who documented it before access became restricted, the remnants of domestic life are still present. Not artifacts in any museum sense, just the evidence of someone having been there and then not being there, and the house having continued in the interval without them. The broader Barkerville restoration project has been ongoing for decades, but the question of which histories get funding and which get left to lean against their own timbers has been answered implicitly, over and over, by what is standing straight and what is not. Number 11 is the South African War Memorial Caretaker's Cottage in Halifax, Nova Scotia. At the edge of the public gardens, one of the finest examples of a Victorian public garden surviving in North America. There is a small stone cottage that once housed the caretaker responsible for maintaining the adjacent military memorial. When the caretaker's role was eliminated or relocated, nobody had a clear plan for the cottage itself. Heritage designation meant it could not be demolished. Funding constraints meant it could not be restored. So, it has existed in the specific administrative limbo that produces the most quietly devastating form of abandonment. The building that is protected from destruction, but not provided with any reason to survive. The public gardens around it are maintained to a very high standard. The cottage is not. The juxtaposition of the immaculately tended garden bed, 2 meters from a protected heritage building that is actively deteriorating, is the kind of institutional irony that requires no commentary. The federal government has had multiple meetings about it. Number 10 is the farmhouse at the Riel homestead near Saint Vital in Manitoba, Louis Riel's mother's house. The structure where Riel spent portions of his early life before the events that made him either a father of Confederation or a traitor, depending on which province you were taught Canadian history in, and which remains one of the most contested questions in how this country understands itself. The homestead is a provincial historic site. Parts of it have been preserved, but the outbuildings and the broader property have deteriorated at a rate that does not match the site's official cultural status. And the gap between what the site represents and what is being done to maintain it has been a subject of recurring frustration among Métis communities for whom this is not a heritage site, in the abstract sense, but a physical location connected to a living history. There is a specific grief in watching a place that matters decay. Not the grief of an ending, the grief of an indifference that is worse than an ending, because an ending at least has the dignity of being a decision. Number 9 is the Shaughnessy Mansion, known as Glen Bray, on Devonshire Crescent in Vancouver, built in 1910 for William Lamont Tate, a socially ambitious man who spent money he did not necessarily have on a house designed to signal status. He was still less accumulating. The house changed hands multiple times through the 20th century. It was a nursing home. It was divided into suites. It went through a period of neglect, serious enough that heritage advocates made noise about it, and then it went through a period of attention, and then it went through another period of neglect. That cycle of attention and neglect is the specific pattern that characterizes a building caught between the cost of restoration and the value of the land beneath it. In Vancouver, the land beneath a Shaughnessy mansion is worth a number that creates a very specific kind of pressure on every owner who acquires the property. The house is worth saving. The lot is worth more empty. That arithmetic is never resolved. It is just endured year by year while the roof absorbs one more winter. Number 8 is the Ghost House near Esterhazy, Saskatchewan. It does not have a name that appears in any official record. It is a 2-story wood frame farmhouse set in a field that has been actively farmed around it for decades. The family that built it left during one of the waves of rural depopulation that moved through the Saskatchewan plains in the mid-20th century. as mechanized farming reduced the number of people required to work the land, and small towns lost the economic base that had made them viable. The house was left furnished. That is the detail that stays with you when you look at the photographs. The family did not take everything. They took what they could carry, or what fit in the vehicle, and they left the rest, because the rest was not worth the cost of moving it relative to the cost of what they were leaving to find. Inside, chairs are still arranged around a table. A curtain is still on a window. A calendar is still on a wall, stopped at a month that has been accumulating distance from the present for over 50 years now. Saskatchewan has hundreds of these houses. Some of them are documented by photographers who make the specific pilgrimage to decaying farmhouses that constitutes a recognizable photographic genre in this country. Most of them are not documented at all. They simply stand in their fields while the farms they anchored continue to be worked by people who live somewhere else and drive in. Number 7 is the tuberculosis ward at the Tranquille Sanatorium in Kamloops, British Columbia. The full sanatorium complex operated from 1907 until 1958, when the development of effective antibiotics made the isolation and rest model of tuberculosis treatment obsolete overnight. The province used the property for other purposes afterward: a colony farm, a residential facility, a summer camp briefly. When the final institutional use ended, the buildings were not demolished, they were simply left. The main building, the farm outbuildings, the cottages where patients had lived while they waited to find out whether they were going to recover or not. The site is on the edge of Kamloops Lake, which is beautiful in a way that reads as deliberately cruel given what the sanatorium was. Patients who arrived by rail were met with a view of the lake and mountains that was clearly intended to suggest that healing was possible in a landscape like this. Many of them healed, many of them did not. The tuberculosis ward specifically, the building where the most serious cases were treated, has been off limits for years. The roof has failed in sections. The interior has been exposed to enough weather to make it structurally unpredictable. Urban explorers have documented it. The documentation is the specific combination of beautiful decay photography and the knowledge of what happened inside the frame that makes these images impossible to look at neutrally. A room where someone died waiting to find out if they would live is still a room. The bed frames are still in it. Number 6 is the Leon Choil Hermitage in Yoho National Park, British Columbia. A stone structure built in the 1930s by a Swiss guy named Edouard Fauze Jr. on land he did not own. In a national park where private structures were not permitted, but were occasionally tolerated in the era when the rules around such things were applied with less consistency than they are now. Fauze built the Hermitage as a personal retreat. He used it for years. When he stopped using it, the National Park Service neither demolished it nor maintained it. It exists in the category of structures that Parks Canada has inherited and not decided what to do with, which is a category with more members than most park visitors would suspect. The Hermitage is in the backcountry, accessible by trail, which means the people who find it have generally walked several hours to do so. The combination of its stone construction, which has kept it more intact than wood frame structures of the same age, and its location, which keeps the casual visitor away, means the Hermitage has an atmosphere that is genuinely difficult to account for in rational terms. A stone room in the mountains built by a man who wanted to be alone in a specific place, still waiting. Number 5 is the house on Gould Street in Toronto that was the childhood home of Glenn Gould, the pianist, the Goldberg Variations, the person many people consider the most important musician Canada produced in the 20th century. The house was demolished in 1956, which puts it outside the technical definition of abandoned. But the lot it stood on remained undeveloped for years afterward. The specific address, the place where the most identifiable Canadian musical mind of the century had grown up, sat empty in a city that was in the process of becoming a different city than the one Gould had inhabited. Eventually, the lot was built on. There is no marker. The specific location of the house is a matter of some historical reconstruction rather than obvious fact. A plaque exists nearby, which is the thing Canada does when it has allowed the building to disappear, but would prefer the history not to. The plaque is on a building that was not there when the history happened, which describes the situation exactly. Number 4 is the Pleasant Camp Border Station at the Alaska-Yukon border on the Haines Road. When the road was rerouted, the border crossing point moved and the previous station was abandoned in place. The buildings, the inspection booths, the small administrative structures, the residences for the officers posted there, were left standing. They are still standing. The Canada-US border in the southern Yukon is not the most heavily trafficked stretch of international boundary on the continent. And the agency responsible for the abandoned station has other priorities than deciding what to do with structures that are no longer in use but are also not causing any immediate problem. So, they stand. At the old crossing point that is no longer the crossing point, waiting for a jurisdiction to claim responsibility for deciding what happens next. The jurisdiction has not yet made that decision. The buildings have continued standing in the interval, which is what buildings do when nobody makes a decision about them. It is the most common form of abandonment in Canada, not a dramatic departure, a deferral that becomes permanent through accumulated inaction. Number 3 is Britannia Beach's old assay office, between Squamish and Vancouver on the Sea to Sky Highway. The Britannia mine ran from 1904 until 1974, and was for a period the largest copper mine in the British Commonwealth. The infrastructure it left behind has been partially converted into the Britannia Mine Museum, which is one of the better industrial heritage sites in the province. But the assay office and several ancillary buildings on the upper levels of the site are not part of the museum operation. They are part of the site's accumulation of structures that are too historically significant to be easily demolished and too expensive to restore. The view from the upper levels looks down at the fjord. The building looks back at the mountain. Nobody is responsible for the building in any active sense. A heritage designation protects it from one kind of fate. The weather is responsible for the other. The assay office at Britannia is the physical evidence of the specific work that the mine required, the testing and evaluation of ore that determined whether any given load was worth processing. The building where that determination happened is itself now undergoing its own evaluation, and the answer keeps being deferred. Number 2 is the house at Old Chelsea in the Gatineau Hills of Quebec, on a hillside above the Gatineau River, that local residents know as the Dion House, without being entirely certain that the name is accurate. It is a 2-story fieldstone structure that was built sometime in the mid-19th century, using stone cleared from the land around it, in the specific manner of Quebec rural construction that produced houses that were extremely cold and extremely durable in roughly equal measure. The family that last lived in it left in the 1970s. The fieldstone exterior has held. The wood frame interior has not. The floors of the upper story came down years ago. The interior of the house is now one room that extends 2 stories, the result of a gradual structural failure that had no single catastrophic moment. You can stand in what was the ground floor and look up through what was the upper floor at the sky, which is framed by fieldstone walls that will still be standing when everyone alive today is gone. Fieldstone does not apologize. It does not negotiate with weather or time. It simply remains long after the reasons for remaining have been otherwise resolved. And number 1 is the Bowen Island house known locally as the Grandfather House, on an unpaved road above Snug Cove. Bowen Island is 45 minutes by ferry from Horseshoe Bay, and the Grandfather House has been abandoned for long enough that nobody now living on the island has a complete account of who last lived there, or precisely when they left. What is known is what is visible. The house is wood frame, probably built in the 1920s or 1930s. West Coast vernacular with a covered porch and a roofline that has sagged under the weight of decades of rain, in a way that suggests another winter or two will be the deciding factor. It is surrounded by second-growth forest that was not there when the house was built, and that has been slowly returning the clearing to forest since whoever cleared it departed. The trees are closer to the walls than they were a decade ago. The root systems of the largest ones are close enough to the foundation to be a structural concern. The house is not visible from the road. It is not on any official list. It has no designation. It appears in no heritage registry. It is simply there, in the trees, on the island, doing what houses do when nobody is inside them, which is wait. That waiting is the whole subject. We talk about abandoned houses in terms of what happened in them, which is the dramatic version, or in terms of what they cost to restore, which is the practical version, or in terms of their heritage value, which is the political version. But the thing about these 15 houses, and about the many hundreds more like them scattered across the second largest country on Earth, is simpler than any of those framings. A house is built around people. When the people leave, something in the structure continues to be oriented toward their return. The windows face outward, the doors remain hinged to open, the rooms hold their shapes. This is not sentimentality, it is physics. A building designed for occupation does not redesign itself for abandonment. It simply waits, in the configuration it was left in, for whatever comes next. In Canada, what comes next is usually another winter, and then another. And in the interval, the house continues to stand, and the question of whether anyone will return remains technically open.